There was a small, secluded hospital located on the outskirts of a quiet town. It was one of those places people didn't really talk about, almost as if they were avoiding mentioning its name. The hospital had been in operation for decades, but its age showed in the peeling paint, the creaking floors, and the faint smell of antiseptic that lingered in the air. The staff was old, and the few young nurses who worked there often seemed uneasy, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Emily, a young nurse in her 20s, had just started her shift at the hospital. She had heard stories from her colleagues, vague whispers that seemed too strange to be true. But on that cold winter evening, Emily would soon discover that some stories were meant to be believed. It was late, and the hospital was quiet, save for the faint sound of medical equipment beeping in the distance. Emily was assigned to work in the intensive care unit, a place known for its high-stakes patients. The air felt heavy, like it was holding secrets, and Emily could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. One of the more unsettling things about this particular ward was room 312. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, just another sterile, white room with a bed and machines. But over the years, strange things had happened in that room. No one really talked about it directly, but there were rumors. Nurses would avoid it if they could, and the patients who had been in that room rarely made it out. On her second night shift, Emily was asked to check on room 312. She hesitated for a moment. A chill ran through her spine, but she pushed the thought away. It was just a room, after all. When she walked down the narrow corridor, the lights flickered as she approached. Room 312 was at the very end of the hall, and the door was slightly ajar. Emily pushed it open, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. The patient in the bed was an elderly man, his skin pale and thin, almost translucent. He lay motionless, his eyes closed, yet something about the room felt off. The monitors beeped rhythmically, but the beeping was slow, too slow. Emily checked the screen. His heart rate was dropping. She immediately adjusted the settings on the machine, trying to stabilize him. But as she did, she noticed something strange. The man's eyes opened, wide open, and stared at her. His gaze was not frantic or desperate, but cold, calculating. Emily felt a wave of unease wash over her. "Help me," he whispered, though his lips didn't move. Emily froze. She was sure she had heard him speak, but it wasn't possible. The man was unconscious. She reached for the call button to get assistance but stopped when she heard him speak again. This time, his voice was clearer, almost a whisper in her ear. "You can't leave. You'll stay here. Forever." The room grew colder, and Emily's breath came out in visible puffs. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the phone and dialed for help, but the line was dead. The beeping of the monitor started to glitch, and the lights above her flickered again, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The man in the bed began to twitch, his body contorting in unnatural ways. Emily stepped back, her mind racing. The air in the room felt suffocating. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew she had to get out. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Emily screamed, her pulse pounding in her ears. She pulled at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if someone, was holding it shut from the inside. Her heart raced as she turned toward the bed. The man was no longer lying still. He was sitting up, his mouth wide open in a silent scream, but no sound came out. His eyes were locked on her, filled with an unnatural, haunting intensity. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Emily could see her breath fogging in front of her. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet as she tried to escape. The lights flickered once more, and when they returned, the room was completely empty. The bed was empty. The man was gone. Shaking, Emily rushed to the nurse's station, her hands clammy and her mind racing. She found a colleague there, an older nurse who had worked at the hospital for years. Emily gasped for breath, trying to explain what had happened. The nurse didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded slowly, as if she had heard this story 1,000 times before. "Room 312, she said, her voice low. "It's been like this for years. The man who was there. He never left. No one ever really leaves room 312. Emily's face went pale. What do you mean? He was there, right in front of me. I saw him. The nurse looked at her gravely. They say the people who end up in that room, they're not really patients. They're souls. And once they come through, they never leave. You should never go in there alone. Emily was shaken, but it didn't end there. Over the following weeks, she began hearing the same story over and over from her colleagues. Each one had their own eerie encounter with room 312, each one more unsettling than the last. Some nurses claimed they could hear faint whispers coming from the room late at night. Others said they had seen strange shadows moving behind the curtains. But the most chilling part: every time a new patient was admitted to room 312, they never lasted long. No one knew exactly what happened in that room. Was it haunted? Was there a curse? Or was it simply a place where the forgotten souls of the hospital's past lingered, waiting for the next person to cross their path? To this day, room 312 remains locked, its door sealed tight. But the whispers never stop. Nurses who work at the hospital say they sometimes hear the faint sound of beeping from that room, even though the machines have long since been turned off. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear a voice, a cold, distant whisper. Help me. You'll stay here. Forever. There was a hospital in a small town, tucked away from the busy roads, where few patients were ever admitted. The building was old, its windows often fogged up and its walls showing signs of wear. People used to say that the hospital was cursed, and even though it had all the modern equipment, no one wanted to stay there. It was as if the place itself was suffused with something dark, something that made it hard to explain. Michael, a young man in his early 30s, had recently been transferred to this hospital after a car accident. He had suffered broken ribs and internal bleeding, and after a few days, the doctors decided he needed to stay for further monitoring. Michael didn't mind, it was just another part of his recovery. But from the moment he entered the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The room they assigned him to seemed clean and well-maintained, but there was a strange sense of stillness in the air. His nurse, a woman named Sarah, was kind but distant. She never smiled, and she always spoke in a calm, almost mechanical tone. Michael brushed it off, thinking it was just the stress of the situation. It wasn't until his second night that things began to take a strange turn. Michael woke up in the middle of the night, his throat dry, his body aching from the accident. He reached for the water bottle on the bedside table, but when he sat up, he noticed something odd. At the far corner of the room, next to the window, there was a figure standing in the shadows. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, it was late, and the dim light from the hallway was casting strange shapes on the walls. But then the figure moved. It was a woman, dressed in a hospital gown, her hair long and tangled. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and her eyes were wide open, staring directly at Michael. Her skin was cold, and there was something unsettling about her presence, something that made Michael's blood run cold. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer. She simply stood there, staring at him, unmoving, her expression blank. Michael tried to call for the nurse, but his voice faltered. He grabbed the call button and pressed it, but the sound of the bell never came. The room was completely silent except for the soft hum of the machines. With a surge of fear, Michael threw the blankets off and rushed to the door, but as he grabbed the handle, he realized it was locked. He panicked, trying to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the woman moved toward him. She didn't walk or shuffle, she just glided across the floor, her feet not seeming to touch the ground. The closer she got, the colder the air became, and Michael could see his breath fogging in front of him. The woman stopped just inches away from him, her eyes never leaving his. She reached out her hand, fingers trembling. Michael stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat. It was as if the very air had thickened, choking him. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. Michael stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, his body stiff with fear. He dared not move, afraid she might return. Finally, he heard the soft click of the door unlocking. Sarah entered the room, her face expressionless as usual. "Is everything okay, Mr. Reed?" she asked calmly. Michael could barely speak. "There was someone in here," he stammered. Sarah didn't seem surprised. She looked at him for a moment, then glanced over to the corner where the woman had stood. There was nothing there now, just the empty space where the figure had once been. "That's impossible," she said quietly, almost to herself. "There hasn't been anyone in this room except you." "Then who was that woman?" Michael demanded. "She was right there, right in front of me." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, a look of something, regret, flashing in her eyes. She turned toward the window, avoiding his gaze. "That room has a history, Mr. Reed. It's been a long time since anyone has seen her, but she's still here. They say she's the one who never left." Michael was confused. "Who is she? What does she want?" Sarah paused, her voice growing softer. "Her name was Helen. She was a patient here, many years ago. She was brought in after an accident similar to yours, but her injuries were much worse. She passed away in this very room." Michael felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean? She passed away here? But she looked so alive. So real." Sarah turned back to him, her face now serious. "She never left. People say she's trapped in this room, waiting for someone else to join her. And when she finds someone in need, she comes to collect them." Michael's mind raced. "Are you saying she's dead?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Helen was never able to move on. She's not a ghost in the way you might think. She's a patient, like you. Someone who was forgotten. And in the hospital, there are rooms like this, rooms where the lost souls linger. But they can't be seen by just anyone. You're lucky she came to you. Maybe she's trying to help. Maybe she's trying to take you with her." Michael could hardly breathe. The weight of what Sarah had said hung in the air like a dark cloud. The woman in the corner, Helen, had once been like him, just another patient. But now, she was trapped in this hospital, haunting the place she had never left. From that night on, Michael tried to ignore the strange occurrences. The flickering lights, the cold air, the whispers that echoed in the hallways. But every time he closed his eyes, he could still see her, Helen, standing in the corner of his room, waiting. No one knew if she was truly a ghost or if she was simply lost, trapped between life and death. But one thing was clear: if you ever stayed in that hospital long enough, you might find yourself joining her, another patient forgotten by time. And the room. Room 217, the one where she had passed away. It was always waiting for its next occupant. It was late when Laura arrived at the hospital. She had just finished her shift at the nearby clinic and had come to visit her brother, Tom, who had been in a serious car accident a week earlier. Tom had been transferred to the local hospital for specialized care, and although he was recovering, Laura couldn't help but feel anxious about leaving him alone at night. It wasn't just the late hour, it was something about the hospital itself that gave her an unsettling feeling. The building was old, and despite the modern equipment inside, there was a distinct, almost ancient atmosphere to it. The hallways echoed with every step, and the fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly above. The hospital had been renovated multiple times, but it still carried the weight of decades of history, stories whispered among the staff, rumors about things that couldn't be explained. Laura made her way to the room where Tom was staying. She opened the door quietly, trying not to disturb him. Tom was asleep, lying in the bed with his arm bandaged and hooked up to several machines. He looked pale, but there was a sense of peace in his expression that put Laura's mind at ease, at least for the moment. She took a seat beside his bed and began reading a book she had brought with her to pass the time. Around midnight, the quiet atmosphere in the room shifted. Laura couldn't quite explain it, but she felt a sudden chill. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and the buzzing of the overhead lights became more pronounced. She looked up from her book, trying to ignore the nagging sensation at the back of her mind. That's when she saw the shadow. It was just a flicker at first, a movement from the corner of the room. Laura's heart skipped a beat, and she glanced toward the source of the disturbance. The hospital room was dim, with only the pale light from the hallway seeping through the partially open door. But in that faint light, Laura could make out a figure standing at the foot of Tom's bed. It was a man. He was dressed in a hospital gown, but his face was obscured by the shadows. Laura couldn't make out any distinct features, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood there, unmoving. "Hello?" Laura asked, her voice shaking as she stood up from the chair. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, silent and still. Laura took a step forward, her mind racing. Was it a visitor, someone else who had gotten lost in the hallway at this hour? But as she got closer, the figure didn't turn to acknowledge her. It didn't seem to breathe, or even shift in response to her presence. Then, with a sense of dread creeping over her, Laura noticed something even more disturbing. The figure was transparent. It wasn't a person at all. In an instant, the figure began to move, gliding across the floor with eerie silence. Laura froze in place, her pulse quickening. It was like watching a specter, a ghostly presence that didn't belong in the world of the living. The man, or whatever it was, moved toward the door and disappeared through it as if walking through a wall. Laura stood paralyzed for a long moment, trying to process what she had just seen. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and she quickly turned to Tom, hoping for some comfort, some reassurance that everything was normal. But when she looked at him, her heart nearly stopped. His eyes were wide open, staring into space. He wasn't awake, but his gaze was fixed, locked on something unseen. His body was stiff, as though he had sensed something in the room, something that had terrified him. Laura rushed to his side, shaking him gently. "Tom. Tom, wake up." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Tom's eyes blinked, and his gaze softened as he slowly looked at his sister. He seemed confused, disoriented. "Laura. What's going on?" he whispered hoarsely. I don't know," Laura stammered. "I saw someone in the room. A man. He was standing at the foot of your bed." Tom's face went pale, and he glanced around the room, his eyes darting from corner to corner. I don't remember anyone being in here," he said, his voice shaking. "But I've seen him too." Laura's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Tom hesitated, his eyes never leaving the space near the door. "The first night I was here. I woke up in the middle of the night, and he was standing in the corner of my room. Just watching me. I thought I was dreaming, but when I blinked, he was gone. It felt so real." Laura's skin crawled. "Who is he?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know. I never saw his face, but there was something about him, something that didn't feel right. It's like he's been here all along, waiting for something." Laura's thoughts raced. She had never heard of anyone else experiencing anything like this at the hospital. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Tom's encounter matched the rumors she had overheard from the staff earlier. The strange figure was an old story, one that no one dared to speak of openly. It was said to be the spirit of a man who had died in that very room decades ago, an accident, a tragic mistake, and now he roamed the hospital, appearing at night to those who were most vulnerable. Laura grabbed her phone, determined to get help. She called the nurse's station, but as she dialed, she noticed something even more unsettling. The line was silent. There was no ringing, no response, just a soft static in the background. Her stomach churned with unease. As she turned back to Tom, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. A low whisper echoed through the walls, one that was too faint to understand. Then the door creaked open, and Laura spun around in shock. The man was back. This time, he didn't glide. He walked slowly toward them, his head lowered, and his feet dragging across the floor with a dragging, heavy sound. As he moved closer, Laura saw that his eyes were empty, hollow, lifeless pits that seemed to stare into her soul. And then, just before he reached them, he stopped. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply turned, slowly, and walked back toward the corner of the room, vanishing into the shadows once again. Tom looked at his sister, his voice barely audible. "We have to leave this place. He's not going to let us go." Laura grabbed his hand, pulling him out of the bed, ignoring the panic and fear that gripped her. They needed to get out, to escape the hospital. But as she tried to make her way toward the door, she found that it was locked. She shook the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. And in the quiet darkness, they could hear the faint whisper again, closer this time. "Stay with me. Forever." The room was silent. But somewhere, deep in the shadows, the figure was waiting. James had never liked hospitals. The sterile smell, the long, quiet corridors, the muffled sounds of distant machines, all of it unnerved him. But when his mother was admitted for a minor surgery, he couldn't refuse her request to stay with her for the night. She had always been there for him, and now it was his turn to do the same. The hospital was a modern building, with clean white walls and bright lights that flickered in the long hallways. The staff was kind and professional, but there was something about the hospital that made James feel uneasy. It was too quiet, as if the place was holding its breath, waiting for something. He had been sitting by his mother's side for hours, reading a book, when a nurse entered the room to check on her vitals. He looked up from his reading, offering a tired smile. The nurse was a young woman, in her 20s, with short brown hair and a neat uniform. She seemed friendly, but there was a look in her eyes, a subtle hint of sadness, that James couldn't quite place. "How's she doing?" he asked, glancing at his mother, who was still asleep in her bed. "Stable for now," the nurse replied with a soft smile. "She'll be awake in a few hours, but we'll keep monitoring her." James nodded and resumed his position next to his mother. The nurse left, and the room fell into silence again. He could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of footsteps in the hall. But as the hours dragged on, he began to feel a creeping sense of unease, like someone, or something, was watching him. It wasn't until around midnight that the strange occurrences began. James had been dozing off in the chair next to his mother's bed when he heard soft footsteps outside the door. At first, he thought it was another nurse or perhaps a visitor, but when he looked up, there was no one there. He shrugged it off, thinking he was just overtired. But the footsteps didn't stop. They seemed to be moving closer to the room, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking down the hallway in heavy boots. James stood up and opened the door, but there was no one in the hallway. It was empty, silent, with not a soul in sight. Frowning, he returned to his mother's room and sat back down. The footsteps grew louder again, as if someone was walking right outside the door, but when he checked, the hallway remained empty. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the sounds of the old building settling. But then, the real oddities began. James noticed that the room temperature had dropped. He could see his breath forming in the air, a fine mist of condensation each time he exhaled. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. And there was something else, something far more disturbing. He could hear faint whispers, soft and unintelligible, coming from the corner of the room. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He looked around the room, trying to locate the source of the voices, but saw nothing unusual. The lights flickered briefly, casting long shadows on the walls, and when they returned to normal, he swore he saw a figure standing by the window. A figure that wasn't there before. The figure was pale, almost translucent, wearing a hospital gown. Its face was obscured, but its presence was suffocating, like a heavy weight in the air. James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Shaking, he rubbed his eyes and looked around the room. Everything seemed normal, but the sense of dread wouldn't leave him. The whispers continued, louder now, and he could feel his pulse racing. He turned to his mother, who was still sleeping soundly, unaware of the chilling presence in the room. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure was standing by his mother's bedside. The same pale, hospital-gowned figure, its face still hidden, was looking down at her. James gasped and stood up, his body shaking with fear. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, unmoving, as if it didn't hear him at all. James took a step forward, but the figure didn't flinch. It was as though it was frozen in place, locked in time. Panicked, James reached for his phone to call for help, but when he glanced back at the figure, it was gone. The room was silent once again, and the temperature returned to normal. His breath no longer misted in the air, and the oppressive feeling that had gripped him seemed to vanish. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He quickly called the nurse's station, his voice shaky as he tried to explain what had happened. The nurse on the other end sounded calm, almost too calm, and assured him that someone would be right up. When the nurse arrived, James could see the same sadness in her eyes, a kind of knowing that made him uneasy. She asked him about the situation, but when he described the figure he had seen, she didn't look surprised. Instead, she nodded slowly, almost resigned. "It's not uncommon," she said quietly. "There are stories of patients, those who passed away in this room. Some say they never really leave. They return to check on those who are still here." James frowned, trying to make sense of what the nurse was saying. "What do you mean? Are you telling me that was a ghost?" The nurse's face softened, and she looked at him with a strange pity. "Not exactly. We don't like to use that word. But yes, sometimes the souls of those who passed in this hospital return, especially when someone is here in a vulnerable state. Your mother might have been visited by one of them." James felt his stomach drop. He turned to his mother, who was still asleep in the bed, unaware of the horror that had unfolded around her. He wondered if the figure had been watching over her, or if it was trying to tell him something. That night, James didn't sleep. He sat by his mother's side, too afraid to leave, too afraid to close his eyes. The rest of the night passed in eerie silence, the room feeling far too quiet, too still. The next morning, when the doctors came in to check on his mother, everything seemed normal again. She was awake and alert, asking for a glass of water. She didn't remember anything unusual from the night before. But James couldn't forget. He had seen the figure, heard its whispers, felt its presence. And as he left the hospital later that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching him, still waiting. The hospital might have seemed normal to everyone else, but James knew the truth. Some patients never really left.